Okay, Mariana, first of all, if you could very briefly start off by telling us your story.
My story is complicated by a number of issues, but basically the health problems that caused me trouble with the Welsh Government started around 2007. I had a gallbladder removal and stones removed, and after that I started having other problems, stomach problems, swelling and all sorts of things. By 2012 I was losing weight. Things started to go horribly wrong, and my GP all that time was saying, oh, it's IBS, don't worry, there's nothing we can do, you just have to check your diet and so on. And then I saw a locum, and the locum doctor saw a sample and said, my goodness, you know, there's something else going on here, I'll refer you. By January 2013 things were getting worse, and by April 2013 I discovered that that referral had never gone off. And at that time my symptoms were so severe that a friend paid for me to go privately to the Spire in Bristol. I found a consultant that I thought would be the right type of gastroenterologist because it was a bit complicated. It wasn't straightforward gastroenterology. And she was very good. That was Dr. Melanie Lockett. She immediately did a number of tests on me. As I say, I had to pay for this initial process, and within a few weeks she had identified that I had severe pancreatic insufficiency, that the pancreas, I'd lost 9/10 of my pancreas, and as you probably know, the enzymes in the pancreas not only help you digest food, but they also produce insulin, which you need for sugar balance. And I am in danger of heading to type 1 diabetes. I found out from Dr. Christmas, one of my GPs, that she had now done the referral to Wales for me to continue care with Dr. Lockett in Bristol, not privately, but on the NHS, on her NHS list at Southmead. She then sent that off. I heard nothing. Things were deteriorating. Dr. Lockett wanted to get on with investigating this, and I think people need to know that in Wales, once you've been referred, you don't immediately go on the waiting list. There is a waiting period until you are invited to go onto the waiting list, and then the waiting list can be 1, 2, sometimes 3 years. So this is not detecting problems early enough, and people are dying as a result. So in March 2014 I went to my MP, and that's David T.C. Davis from Monmouthshire, and asked for his help because I considered that NHS Wales was taking far too long to just give me an initial appointment, and I couldn't understand that there must be other people in Wales with other problems who are not getting on a waiting list and are not being seen by a consultant to even do a sort of triage on whose cases need urgency and whose don't. He at that time was looking in any event to see if he could make an amendment to the Welsh bill, because he'd had umpteen reports from Welsh patients suffering because the Assembly in Wales was just too bureaucratic and too many systems at fault, so that patients were not getting seen and not getting the care they needed. All along and through my experience living here for the last 40 years, I've not had a problem with the Welsh Health Service staff. They work wonders and they're very dedicated. But the problem is the systemic failure, I think, of the Assembly to implement the proper checks and controls, and instead have these layers of bureaucracy and meetings and funding issues, and basically the politicians are deciding who has care, not the consultants.
And just rolling back a bit, you mentioned that you not only had to go private, but you had to go across the border to England. Yes. What would have been the consequences if, say, you weren't able to do that and you had to await treatment, the next steps at least in Wales? I
would have been dead. Simple as that. I wasn't producing the enzymes, I couldn't digest food, I was becoming malnourished, and I just wasn't absorbing vitamins or anything.
What comparisons have you drawn between waiting times or less length of time waiting within Wales compared to England?
Well, more recently, I'm in need of a knee replacement. And when I saw the GP about that, this was this time last year, he said, well, I can refer you to Wales because I have to, but there's at least a 2-year waiting list for orthopaedics. And I said, well, I can't wait that long, you know, I'll be lame, I've got steps up and down my house. So he said, well, I'll see what I can do, because some patients are now being referred to Hereford to speed up the Welsh waiting list. Anyway, I did get seen in Hereford last April, and the consultant there has x-rayed and everything and decided that I would have to wait a bit longer before I could go onto his list, because I'm a Welsh patient. I saw him again in December last year, and it definitely needs doing. I am now on the waiting list. And he said to me, but it's 40 weeks, up to 40 weeks for Welsh patients, whereas it's 26 weeks for English patients. And I said, that's racist. You're the same consultant. He said, it's not racist, it's politics. He said, we could get a letter next week that says, please, you know, operate on 20 more Welsh patients to bring our numbers down. So it's political, and you know, people are suffering, and it is wrong.
Obviously we hear, Mariana, stories all the time in the news, individual cases which are unacceptable and people put through the rough unnecessarily. What, you know, even if they're just simple changes, what could change within the Welsh NHS in order to prevent these things happening?
I think, first of all, there should be a choice of consultants, because sometimes patients know of someone or have used someone before in the past. As we stand, you don't know who you're going to get as a consultant. You don't know if their speciality is going to actually fit your problem. You also don't get a choice of hospital. I mean, there's a vague choice where I live of between Abergavenny or Newport. But if it's anything more complicated, it could be the Myler in Wrexham. Now that's 4.5 hours drive from here. There's no north-south motorway in Wales. How do they expect someone to drive all that way for an appointment and say follow-ups or treatment at such distances? It's just ridiculous. So that's one thing. We should have the choice. We should have the choice of the hospital, the choice of the consultant. And there is no reason on earth why the Assembly can't pay back the funding for that patient back to England, because they get a central grant, or otherwise have a funding package that goes with the patient rather than to the government. Because as far as I'm aware, it's health funding is not ring-fenced in Wales at the Assembly. They can spend that money on their own pensions or doing up their office if they want to. It's not actually ring-fenced for patients or for hospitals.
How much do you feel that Cardiff Bay politicians are responsible for the state of the Welsh NHS at the moment?
I think they're wholly responsible for it. It's the Labour politicians in the Assembly, and it's been Labour pretty well, I think, since the start of the Assembly 20 years ago. I think the media as well are to blame to some extent, because since devolution, they still refer on news programmes to the NHS, and we're having more funding for the NHS. They don't stipulate that there's an Irish NHS, there's a Welsh NHS, and there's a Scottish NHS. And they are not all the same, and they don't have the same programme, and they don't have the same policies. There's a lot of people who've never really been seriously ill, and when they come to access that service, then they discover it's all different.
Over the course of 20 years, we had the referendum in 1997, the Assembly opened its doors in 1999. How do you feel, perhaps cases quite close to your heart, that devolution has changed the way that the health service performs in Wales?
Well, my son, there's a picture of him there, my son tragically died in 2009. He was only 25, but he was born with profound disabilities. He had agenesis of the corpus callosum, bilateral talipes, and he was autistic, although that wasn't diagnosed till he was 21. So his education was a mess because of all that. Health-wise, he saw consultants in England and Wales. And initially, that carried on fine. And then in about 2005, I would say, we started to notice differences. For instance, he wore special shoes. They were always supplied at Frenchay Hospital when I was there, and he saw a consultant there. And then suddenly that was all switched. We had to go to Lanfrec for Grange, so we had to have new people, and for anyone with autism, anything new is tricky, and deal with that. That was just one aspect. His eye consultant was in Bristol. Then we were told he couldn't go to that eye consultant for the next follow-up, even though he'd seen that man all his life, because he had to go into Wales. And that, as I say, was around 2005. He died in 2009 from a ruptured brain aneurysm, and it was sudden and it was tragic. And I don't think mothers ever get over losing their child. His care was systematically being moved over to Wales only. And then, of course, he was dead by 2012. But in 2012, I noticed that suddenly the barriers went up. And people were, because I'd written some newspaper articles on my problems earlier than that, people were contacting me and saying, we can't get our healthcare, we can't get anything done. I was also involved with a group called Action for Our Care, with a lady on the other side of the river, 2 miles away, same GP practice, and she was fighting on behalf of English patients because they were being dictated to by the Welsh Assembly as to where they could get treatment, simply because our GP is registered with Wales. So even though they had English postcodes, they were fined that they couldn't go into the same consultants in Gloucester and so on, and there was an uproar.
There hasn't been a campaign to get rid of the Assembly really since devolution in '97, but an increasing number of people are beginning to question its actual existence. It's actually even its existence. What do you feel the future is for the Assembly in Cardiff Bay?
Zilch. They are meddling in too many aspects of government and creating layers and layers, unnecessary layers of governance that nobody wants, and it's preventing the action from occurring. Politicians are in control of who gets healthcare. They are in control of what schools get. They are in control of whether we have an M4 relief road or not. There are so many aspects of the Assembly. They are creating policies and governance for the sake of it, and it wants stripping away.
And there's even talk of from the likes of Plaid Cymru certainly, and Labour are following suit of increasing devolution. And what would your view be on the fact that they're talking about trying to have a Welsh devolved criminal justice system when they can't, as in the cases you've highlighted, even solve
they can't solve the basics. Yeah. I think, if anything, it'll never happen overnight. They won't allow it. The south of Wales is still Labour oriented, even though the Conservatives made gains in the last general election. It's the people as well. It's not just the policies, it's the people in these positions who are so full of themselves, so bothered about whether they've, how important they are, and they're missing the point that the people of Wales have suffered for the last 20 years. Everything was working fine. If we started on health, I think that will be a good place to start. I firmly believe that the National Health Service should have remained as that, as we have a national army. If there's a problem in Wales, an invasion in Wales, the British Army will come in and sort it out. If there's a problem in the Welsh Health Service, we're reliant upon these self-imposed politicians. So we need to get a streamlined system. One of the problems here on the border, and I found to my cost, I had to call an ambulance when I was seriously ill, and my telephone exchange number here is Forest of Dean, even though I'm in Wales, physically in Wales. So when you ring the out of hours or you ring for an ambulance, it goes through to a call centre in England, because they're picking up an English code number. So they arrange for an ambulance to come. When they get onto the next part of the call, they say, we can't come to you because your postcode is in Wales. So we have to go, you have to ring another number. Now if you're seriously ill in the middle of the night, you do not want this hassle of border controls. When my son collapsed, which was a Friday morning, I rang the ambulance. They took 40 minutes or more to get here. Now, I rang again because I was concerned he was unconscious, and eventually they sent me a paramedic from Colford, who happened to be in Colford, and he got here first. Now, the paramedic and I, between us, both agreed that we thought he'd had a massive seizure or a blood loss in the brain. Then the ambulance crew arrived from Wales, and the paramedic said, we're taking this person to Frenchay because that's where his notes are, and that was a centre of excellence. I mean, it's all moved to Southmead now, but it was a centre of excellence for brain operations or brain problems. And the Welsh crew said, we can't do that, we haven't got the paperwork, we can't take him. And fortunately the paramedic laid the law down and said, you take my car, I'm going in with the patient, you drive the ambulance, we're going to Frenchay. And he arranged it, and we did. And I was really pleased that he got here first, because if my son had been taken to Swansea, he'd have been dead before he got there.